Welcome to Gaia Dairy Farming Insights, the infotainment podcast for the Dairy Farming Network. Join our community that takes you on a journey through the vastness of milk production, your source of knowledge and inspiration in every episode.
Welcome everyone to our next Dairy Farming Insights podcast. And today's episode is When Every Step Hurts, Understanding and Tackling Lameness in Dairy Cows. And I have the great pleasure of being joined today by Gillian Fullerton-Smith. And actually, I might as well just ask you, Gillian, to introduce yourself to everyone.
Oh, thanks, Ollie. And it's a pleasure to be here talking to everybody in the podcast community. So many of you will know me. I'm Gillian Fullerton-Smith. I'm from the north coast of Scotland, and I spent a long time farming in New Zealand. In fact, about 20 years dairy farming in New Zealand. But on top of all that, I've been around the dairy tech industry for a number of years in New Zealand and in Russia and Ireland, UK and South America. So I'm well across the industry.
Great. So with that absolute wealth of experience, Gillian, let's just dive straight into the topic. And I suppose from your perspective, how common is lameness in dairy herds, and why is this such a big issue for farmers around the world?
There's probably two parts of that I'll answer. From my own experience farming in New Zealand, it was one of the biggest issues we had. I think there were times in our herd when we would have had around 25-30% lame cows in the entire herd. And it's only now that I'm working with CattleEye and we're working with industry specialists that, in fact, this is often the norm. And that's a huge percentage. 30% of all dairy cows have some kind of form or extent of lameness, be it simple dermatodigititis, may it be white line bruising, there's often some form. And, often when you think of illnesses with dairy cows, you might think about mastitis. But in fact, mastitis is quite easily treated with tubes, but lameness can be much more difficult because it's more difficult to detect and often it can become chronic. And once it's chronic, it's really hard to go back from that.
Mm. And is it always visible? Or is that something now you see now with CattleEye?
You've really hit one of the nails in the head, because what can happen with lameness is that you can spot a lame cow. She's hobbling along on three legs. I can. Anybody can. But what about those early stages, those early stages where she's just on the cusp and her lameness is increasing, but it's not that visible unless perhaps you're a vet or someone really in tune with this. So what often happens, Ollie, it's a terrible thing, is that often lame cows are missed. And they're only detected when they're chronic. And by then, it's really almost too late.
So that would lead nicely on to my sort of next thought around animal welfare. So beyond just the fact that the animal is lame and obviously uncomfortable, what kind of costs and other things could that manifest into for farmers?
Well, that's a really interesting question, because often we deal with farmers, and if they discuss what lameness actually costs them, what they think about is the treatment cost. They might think about an antibiotic. They might think about a vet visit. They might think about bandages and blocks. But the reality is it's much greater than that. And within the role that I'm in now in CattleEye, I spent a lot of time going to different conferences with hoof trimmers, with vets. And what they all agree on is that there's 4 parts to the costs around lameness. The first one's a very obvious one, that a lame cow, her production is going to drop. You get that. She's uncomfortable. She's in pain. It's going to drop. The second one that's going to happen is her fertility is going to drop. Lame cows are not going to cycle. So she'll miss that cycle. And if that lameness is not dealt with, she might miss the next one, and so on and so on. The third one is the one we already spoke about, is the treatment cost. And that fact is often the smallest part of it. The treatment cost is the smallest overall part. And the fourth one is culling. So you can get a fantastic cow, fabulous genetics, super high production, and this cow can end up being culled because nobody picked her lameness on time. The actual numbers around this, and these again are industry numbers, they can vary between about $70 per case up to around $550 per case, depending on all sorts of different factors. But as you can imagine, the costs are really significant.
And it's those indirect hidden costs that are the contributors as opposed to your direct treatment. Okay, that's very interesting. And you spoke earlier about your experience in New Zealand and things like that. Could you go a bit more into some real life examples from your own farm or other farmers you've worked with that really show the impact that can have on herd performance and profitability?
Sure. Well, I saw this firsthand farming in New Zealand when we had a significant amount of lameness. Our farming in New Zealand was pasture-based, so the cows were doing lots of walking. And because we had added more
stone tracks, was that?
Yeah, they weren't stone, they were a different sort of material, often lime we used. So they looked okay, but nevertheless, there were actually sharp parts in the raceway they were walking that they would stand on, they would get lame. So that tended to be white line and bruising. And because really the team that we have, they weren't really experienced enough to be able to detect this. They, again, like we spoke about earlier, if she was super late, they could pick it. But those early stages, they couldn't. They just couldn't see this. So we could never get there on time. Similarly, I'm seeing this on the TMR farms, the freestall barns all over the world, because we're working a lot in the United States and Spain. We're in South Africa, Australia, Germany. And we see the same thing. We see when we start working with the herds, all these lameness factors come in. But one of the key things is they often don't have the labour to be able to pick these cows. And another thing that's happening that we are seeing is that many of the milk processors now, they want to be very, very sure that the animal welfare meets their standards. So when you have a situation with high lameness in a herd, this has to be dealt with. And these supermarkets want to see this too. So this is, again, where automation comes in, because you're getting an absolute standard AI intervention on a daily basis, and you've got that accuracy that becomes so difficult in day-to-day farming.
So it's a real helpful tool they can use, because obviously I know it's something in the industry and people work very hard to reduce the lameness, but this is another tool they can use to help them to do that.
You're so right in that. I think all farmers try really, really hard to manage their lameness, because they don't want to see their fantastic well-bred cows limping along. They don't want to see that. But as farms get bigger, it becomes harder and harder to manage because of often the lack of skill on the farm. And with the best intentions, they also can't see those early stages. Whereas with the AI, and this is a fantastic stat. We actually know now, we've got this proven by science, we can detect a lame cow 23 days earlier than the human eye.
Wow, 23 days.
Yeah.
So actually, then, what are other steps or some of the most effective steps farmers can take to prevent it in the first place? Picking it up's one thing, but actually prevention is even better. But also, I suppose there's some challenges about implementing that. So maybe talk about what they can do to prevent it in the first place.
Sure. And there are lots of things that they can do to prevent it. And most farmers try to do this within their budget and their capability, and given what they've got to work with. So, for example, if they have a very old cow shed, if it's a very old parlour and the concrete's rough, that's going to give ongoing issues. And they need to think about this, because we see this around the world too. We see herds increasing, and sometimes they increase before the parlour size increases. So you might have cows standing, waiting for a long time, where they should perhaps be on a nice big rotary. They're still in a very, very small parlour. So they're standing on concrete for a long time. That certainly causes lameness. And then there's other things that we can do with that as well. We can talk about with farmers, they can look at rubber matting. That's another thing that helps significantly as well. Nice matting. So all of those things, they can often be advised about how to do those things, and their vets and nutritionists will talk to them about that. Sometimes they can't do it right away. But even, Oliver, when people have gone to the extent of putting in rubber mats and done the best they can, cows still just sometimes get lame during the breeding season with cows jumping. Even with the best of concrete, they can still have abrasion. With different types of bedding, there can be issues. So even with the best of care and the best of facilities, and we see this, there's still going to be that underlying lameness that has to be detected.
Okay. And then if I assume then some of these things they could do, maybe rubber mats, foot bath, avoiding tight, sharp turns, that kind of thing, or cows running around. What do you see is sort of easier or harder for people to implement as you go around visiting these farms?
I think what they can implement immediately is to get the assistance from artificial intelligence, because it's not a great cost. It's a simple 2D camera. Install that camera, and immediately then they can start dealing with the lameness that they have. I mean, it's wonderful that people can install new parlours and have new yards and different backing gate systems. If they can change those hard turns that the cows have to do, they often can't do that. Some of those things are without their budget. They're not going to be able to manage that. But being able to detect the correct cows at the correct time is critical. And just thinking about that for a moment too, we'll often see in the large herds that they've got people trying to spot the lame cows. What often happens is those early cows, they can't see that. But what often happens is they look at cows as they're coming out and they don't know if they're lame or not because they're using the human eye. Again, it's best of intentions. And the cows that are actually increasingly getting lame, they don't see them. And then there's other cows that maybe they're older cows, say, for example, they have a different gait. That's just how they walk. These cows are not lame. And what can happen is they're misidentifying cows. So the cows that need to be trimmed don't get trimmed. The cows that don't need to get trimmed end up going to be trimmed. And it's quite stressful for a cow, when she's taken away from the herd and she's having her feet trimmed. And this happens sometimes when they don't need it. So the key point I would say for a farm with the limited resources that they have is identify the right cows, trim the right cows, and make sure that the cows that don't need to be trimmed, leave them alone, don't put them through the stress. And when people start putting those management systems in place, it's very easy for us to monitor this because we can see all the data coming through. We can see their lameness improving, their production increasing, and along with it, all those other things like fertility and reproduction.
Yeah. I think we've gone into a nice bit of detail there about the role the camera technology and AI solutions can play on these farms, obviously detecting the cows earlier, helping you give the specific treatment, right animal, right time. How have you seen this deployed on farms, and what difference has it made?
Oh, it's made a tremendous difference. And we've got so many examples. I don't know where to start, but I think I'll start with this farmer that we had in Arizona. He was a farmer with, he had 4,000 cows. And at World Dairy Expo last year, he was just chatting about this, and he declared to his vet that he probably had one of the worst lamenesses. He started using CattleEye, and he now says he's one of the much better guys now. So we were having these testimonials unprompted by us about the improvements that we're seeing. It's been huge for people because if you think 4,000 cows and the staff that he had around that trying to manage this has reduced his labour requirement significantly because now this has been picked for him. Prior to this, he would have had 3 guys watching these cows for 8 hours a day, watching cows and often picking the wrong cows and not detecting the correct cows. So now he knows he's got the right cows every time, and it's fantastic. So he's one example of many. And it's not just the 4,000 cow farms either. Even your family farms that we see around the place, maybe the 300 cow farms and less, maybe 200 cow farms. Again, it's making sure they're identifying the right cows. And it's one less job. It's one less. The farmers have got enough to do. And this is a job that they don't need to do. And it's going to be done right. And then they know when their foot trimmer comes that they're the right cows.
So there you are, everyone. AI and camera technology for detecting lameness in cows. And that brings us to the end of our podcast this time with Gillian. So I want to thank Gillian very much for joining us and to everyone for listening in. And we'll talk to you on the next one. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Follow us on our social media platforms to stay updated and subscribe to our podcast so you won't miss any future episodes. If you have questions, suggestions, or even ideas for future topics, feel free to reach out. Join us soon for another exciting episode as we continue to explore the world of farming and the people behind it. Until then, keep farming and growing.